There is a hammer in my truck that is 60 years old. Not old in the way most old things are old, worn down, brittle, ready to be replaced. Old in the way well-made things get old. The handle has darkened to the color of old leather from decades of being held by the same hand, then mine. The face is still true. The balance is something I have never found in anything bought from a hardware store shelf. My grandfather made it. Not bought it, made it. He took a bar of high-carbon steel, heated it in a coal forge until it was the color of a summer sunset, and shaped it with his own hammer against an anvil that is still in that workshop, still used, still producing tools that will likely outlast everyone alive today. He made that hammer in 3 hours. Now, walk into any hardware store and look at the hammers. $18, $24, $34 for the premium version. Fiberglass handles that crack at the neck after 2 years of hard use. Heads that are cast rather than forged, which means the steel is not aligned the way forging aligns it, which means the face deforms under impact in a way a forged head does not. Designed to be replaced rather than repaired. Designed to last exactly long enough that you do not feel cheated, but not long enough that you never buy another one. My grandfather's hammer has needed one new handle in 60 years. He turned it himself from a piece of hickory he split from a log behind the workshop. I am going to show you how he made it. The forge, the fire, the steel, the techniques that allowed one man in a workshop behind a house in rural Pennsylvania to make tools that have outlasted everything the modern hardware store has offered in the same period. This is not a video about doing things the hard way because the hard way is virtuous. It is about understanding why the right way and the efficient way diverged somewhere in the last century and what we lost when they did. Stay with me through part 3. The technique for hardening and tempering steel by hand is what most people have never heard of and what determines everything about whether a tool works or fails. My grandfather did it by color, by feel, and by 60 years of knowing exactly what the metal was telling him. My name is Benjamin Yorder. I document traditional skills and craft knowledge, the practices that built this country's working life and that are disappearing at a rate most people do not notice until a specific thing needs doing and there is suddenly no one left who knows how. Blacksmithing is the craft I have spent the most time with over the past 6 years. Not because I am a blacksmith, I am not in the sense my grandfather was, but because every other traditional craft I have documented traces back to it. The timber framer needs a mortising chisel. The farmer needs a cultivator blade. The wheelwright needs a tire iron. The cooper needs a draw knife. Every craft that builds or repairs or produces anything physical has, somewhere in its ancestry, a blacksmith who made the tools that made the work possible. When blacksmithing disappears from a community, when the forge goes cold and the anvil goes to a collector and the knowledge goes with the man who held it, every craft that depended on it becomes more fragile, more dependent on a supply chain that can fail, more expensive, more disposable. My grandfather's name was Walter Yorder. He smithed in a workshop behind his house in Clearfield County, Pennsylvania, for 41 years. He never called himself an artist. He called himself a tool maker. The distinction mattered to him. He died 11 years ago. I have spent 6 years trying to learn and document what he knew. What follows is some of what I have found. A blacksmith's forge is not complicated equipment. At its most basic, it is a fire pot, a bowl or box that holds fuel connected to an air supply that forces oxygen into the fire hot enough to bring steel to working temperature. Working temperature for steel is between 1,800 and 2,300 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on the carbon content and the operation being performed. A fire that hot cannot be sustained by natural draft. The air supply, historically a bellows, later a hand-cranked blower, forces air into the base of the fire and drives the combustion to the temperature the work requires. My grandfather's forge ran on metallurgical coke, coal heated in low oxygen until the volatile compounds burn off and what remains is nearly pure carbon that burns hot, clean, and controllable. A coke fire holds steel at welding temperature for as long as the smith needs it there, without contaminating the work with sulfur. The forge Walter Yorder built is simple, brick and castable refractory, roughly the size of a kitchen sink. The fire pot, cast iron, with tuyere holes in the bottom for the air blast, sits at the center. The hand-cranked blower he bought at a farm auction in 1962 still sits beside it and still turns freely. A working forge is within reach of any person with basic masonry skills and about $200 in materials. Working forges have been built from brake drums welded to pipe, from salvaged cast iron pans, from modified barbecue grills. The form matters less than the function. Contain the fuel, force air into the base, give the steel somewhere to sit in the heat zone. The anvil is the harder problem. A good forged tool steel anvil costs $400 to $1,500 new, and good used anvils have become genuinely scarce. My grandfather's anvil weighs 210 pounds. He bought it from a retired farrier in 1961 for $40. At current market, it would sell for $800 to $1,000. The face is still flat and hard after 60 years of hammer blows. That is what a forged steel anvil does. It lasts longer than the man who uses it. Steel is iron with carbon in it. The amount of carbon determines almost everything about how the steel behaves, how hard it can be made, how tough it is, how it responds to heat, how it holds an edge. Low-carbon steel, what most people call mild steel, contains less than 0.3% carbon. Easy to weld, easy to shape, forgiving of mistakes. Also incapable of being hardened to the degree a cutting tool requires. You can make beautiful shapes from mild steel. You cannot make a chisel or a plane blade that holds its edge. High carbon steel, 0.6 to 1.0% and above, is what tools are made from. More sensitive to overheating, more likely to crack if quenched incorrectly. But it is the only material that can be hardened to the Rockwell values that allow a cutting edge to survive use. My grandfather sourced his high-carbon steel from several places. Old coil springs from junked vehicles, typically 5160 steel, excellent for tools. Leaf springs from trucks and farm equipment. Old files, which are high-carbon tool steel and can be reforged into small tools when worn past usefulness as files. Old chisels, punches, worn tooling returned to the cycle. He said he rarely bought new steel because the supply of high-quality used steel in rural Pennsylvania in the 1960s and 70s was essentially unlimited. Every farm had a pile of broken equipment. Every machine shop had a bin of discarded tooling. Free or nearly free to anyone who knew what to look for. Identifying high-carbon steel without a laboratory requires a spark test, holding the steel against a bench grinder and watching the sparks. High-carbon steel produces a burst, branching pattern, bright and complex. Low-carbon steel produces a long, simple trail with little branching. My grandfather could identify steel grade by spark pattern as reliably as a sommelier identifies a vintage by taste. Not mysticism, pattern recognition built over decades. Here is what I told you to stay for. When a blacksmith puts a piece of steel into the forge and heats it, the steel changes color as it heats. That color change is not cosmetic. It is a direct readout of the steel's temperature, and in traditional blacksmithing, color is the thermometer. No gauge, no digital readout. The color of the metal tells the smith everything he needs to know about what the metal can do at that moment and what he should do with it. At around 900 degrees Fahrenheit, steel begins to show a faint red, barely visible in bright light, clear in shade. This is below working temperature. The metal is warm, but not yet plastic. At 1,400 to 1,500 degrees, a bright cherry red to orange, the steel is at a good forging temperature for most operations. It will move under the hammer without cracking. It is plastic enough to be shaped, but not so hot that it risks burning. At 1,800 to 2,000 degrees, a bright yellow-orange verging on white, the steel is at maximum forging temperature for high-carbon work and approaching the welding range. At this temperature, the metal moves easily and forgives hammer blows that would crack a cooler piece. But it is also close to the temperature at which high-carbon steel begins to burn, to oxidize rapidly in a way that damages the carbon content and weakens the finished tool. The smith who watches color learns to pull the work from the fire at the right moment by instinct, the same way a baker knows bread is done without a timer. The knowledge is in the eye, built over repetition. Hardening and tempering are where this color-reading skill becomes critical. A tool made from high-carbon steel, forged to shape and ground to its working geometry, is not yet hard. It is tough, it will not break under impact, but it is not hard enough to hold a cutting edge. To make it hard, it must be hardened, heated to the hardening temperature for that specific steel, typically a bright cherry red for most tool steels, and then quenched. Plunged rapidly into oil, water, or brine, depending on the steel and the desired result. The rapid cooling locks the carbon in a crystalline structure, martensite, that is very hard and moderately brittle, too brittle to use as a tool. A fully hardened chisel or hammer would shatter on first use rather than dent or deform. So the hardened tool must then be tempered, reheated to a lower temperature that relaxes some of the brittleness while retaining most of the hardness, then cooled again. The temperature for tempering is communicated by color again, not the color of the steel itself, which at tempering temperatures is too cool to glow, but the color of the oxide film that forms on the polished surface as it heats. At around 400 degrees, the oxide film is a pale yellow. At 450, straw yellow. At 500, gold. At 540, brown. At 570, purple. At 600, blue. At 650, gray. Each color corresponds to a specific hardness and toughness balance. A woodworking chisel wants a blue to purple temper, hard enough to hold an edge through wood, tough enough to be struck with a mallet without chipping. A knife blade wants straw to gold. A spring wants blue-gray. The smith chooses the temper color based on what the tool needs to do and what the steel needs to survive doing it. My grandfather polished the surface of his tools with sandpaper before tempering, so the oxide colors would show clearly. He held the work over the forge at a controlled distance and watched the colors run from the hot end toward the cool end of the piece. When the color he wanted reached the cutting edge, he quenched immediately. The timing was a matter of seconds. He did not hesitate. He learned this in a workshop in 1961 from a man who had learned it the same way. I watched him do it dozens of times as a child without understanding what I was watching. I understand it now. and I still cannot do it with his consistency because he had 40 years of repetition behind him and I have 6. The knowledge is in the eye and the hands and the years. There is no shortcut to it. Let me walk through making a hammer, the specific tool my grandfather made in 3 hours that is still in my truck, so the principles from the previous sections become concrete. Starting material: a bar of 4140 chromoly steel, approximately 3 by 1.5 by 4 inches. This produces a finished cross-peen hammer of about 1¼ pounds. The bar goes into the forge. At full orange heat, the eye, the hole through which the handle passes, is punched using a handled punch struck with a sledge, working from both faces toward the center. The punched eye is drifted to final size with a tapered drift tool. The drifted eye has a slight taper that locks the handle in place when driven home and wedged from the top. It cannot pull out. The face is shaped while hot, hammered flat, squared, corners dressed. The peen is drawn out by concentrated hammer blows on the horn of the anvil, stretching the steel in one direction while containing it in the other. The body is fullered, compressed with a rounded tool to refine the waist geometry and distribute the mass in the proportions that give the hammer its balance. Balance transfers more energy per swing and reduces fatigue. It is not decoration. After shaping, the head is normalized twice, heated to full orange and cooled slowly in still air to relieve internal stresses from forging. Hardening: face and peen only, not the eye zone, which must remain tough. The head is heated to hardening color for 4140, and the face is quenched in oil while the eye zone stays above the surface. Face gets hard, eye stays tough. One operation, 2 outcomes, both necessary. Tempering: the face is polished bright. My grandfather held the head over the forge and watched the oxide colors run from hot to cool across the polished face. When blue reached the face, he quenched. Blue temper on a hammer face: hard enough to strike without deforming, tough enough to take impact without chipping. The handle is fitted, driven, and wedged. 3 hours total. A tool that will outlast everyone who touches it. In 1900, there was a working blacksmith shop within 5 miles of almost every farm in the United States. By 1950, most were gone. By 1980, the craft had been reduced to hobbyists, farriers, and a small population of dedicated production smiths. The economic reasons are clear. Machine-made tools are cheaper and faster to produce. The calculation that led communities to close their smithies and buy from the catalog was rational based on the numbers available at the time. What those numbers did not include was durability, repairability, the knowledge lost when the last smith in a county shut down and no apprentice learned what he knew. A factory tool that breaks is replaced. A hand-forged tool that breaks is fixed. That difference compounds over a lifetime into something that matters. My grandfather fixed everything. He made the tools to fix with. He made the tools to make the tools with. There was a self-sufficiency to his workshop that I did not understand as a child, and that I find more remarkable the older I get and the more dependent on outside supply chains everything around me becomes. That habit of mind, fix it, understand it, make it better, is what blacksmithing teaches. The forge is just the classroom. The hammer in my truck is not a museum piece. It is a working tool. I use it. It has driven nails, pulled nails, set stones, tapped chisels, persuaded things that did not want to move. It has done every job a hammer is asked to do, and it has not failed at any of them. It is 60 years old, and it is better than anything I can buy today at any price. That is not nostalgia. That is a statement about what forged high-carbon steel with a properly tempered face and a balanced profile does compared to a cast head on a fiberglass handle designed to meet a price point rather than a performance standard. Walter Yorder made that hammer in 3 hours with a coal forge, an anvil, and 4 hand tools. He never charged for what he made for himself and his neighbors. He charged fair prices for what he made for others, and every one of those customers got 60 years of use from what they paid for. The forge is not gone. The knowledge is not gone. It is held by fewer people than it was 100 years ago, but the people who hold it are teaching it in community colleges, in maker spaces, in private shops, in channels like this one. The fire is still lit. The question is whether anyone is watching to learn what the colors mean. If you want to start, find an anvil, build a fire pot, get a piece of rebar, heat it, and hit it. It does not matter what you make the first time. What matters is what you learn about metal and fire and the relationship between them when you are the one managing that relationship with your own hands. Tell me in the comments if you have ever worked at a forge, what you made, who taught you, what the steel taught you that words cannot. And tell me if someone in your family was a blacksmith, what you remember of the shop. The smell of coal smoke and hot steel is one of those sensory memories people describe the same way across generations, and I think that consistency means something. Subscribe to Benjamin Yorder for the next video where I walk through the 5 tools a beginning smith should make first in the order that builds the skills needed for each one, from a simple hook to a handled chisel to a small hammer you will use for the rest of your life. If you have a forge or are thinking about building one, that video is the practical next step from everything we covered today. Until then, look at the tools in your shop or kitchen or truck with different eyes. Think about what they are made of. Think about what it would take to make one that lasts 60 years rather than 6. The answer is not complicated. It is a fire, a piece of steel, and someone who knows what the colors mean.